The gun went off before Eva Sullivan even reached the saloon doors. She heard it from across the street, that single crack splitting the dry Arizona air like a whip through silence, and she stopped walking. Her boot heels went still on the cracked earth. The dust that had been trailing her settled around her ankles as if even the ground knew to hold its breath. And then came the second sound, worse than the first, the low, ugly laughter of men who had gotten what they wanted. She knew that laughter. She had been hearing it for 3 years in Caldwell Creek, a town so small and sun-bleached that the only thing it had more of than horses was men who felt entitled to take what was not theirs. And every single one of those men knew her name. They called it out when she walked past. They said it when they sat at poker tables and lost money they should have kept. They said it like it was a joke they had already heard and still found funny. Eva Sullivan. Eva Sullivan. The name traveled faster than she did in this town, and she had never once asked it to. She pushed through the saloon doors anyway, because whatever had happened in there was her business now. Bill Crane, the man she worked for, the man who owned the deed to the building she slept in, the man who had made it very clear what she owed him and how she would pay it, was standing in the center of the saloon floor with a smoking pistol and a smile that turned her stomach inside out. There was a stranger on the ground, not dead. She could see his chest moving. But he had been shot through the shoulder, and the blood soaking through his shirt was the dark, serious kind that meant trouble if someone did not get a cloth on it quickly. He was on his back, jaw set, eyes open, and he was looking up at Bill Crane with an expression that had no fear in it whatsoever, which told Eva Sullivan 2 things instantly. First, this man was not from Caldwell Creek. Second, this man was going to get himself killed if she did not do something right now. She did the only thing she could think of. "Bill," she said, her voice cutting through the laughter like a clean blade. "You shoot a man before you check his pockets, you might have just put a bullet in the man the governor sent." The laughter stopped. Bill Crane turned around. And that was the moment she had to start thinking very fast, because she had no idea who the stranger was, what he had done to earn a bullet, or whether her lie would hold for more than 30 seconds. What she knew was that his eyes had shifted to her face the instant she spoke, and whatever he saw there made him stay quiet on the floor instead of doing something stupid, like reaching for the revolver that had been kicked a full 6 feet away from him. The stranger's name was Amos Brenner. She did not know that yet. She would not know it for another 3 days. But when she finally did learn it, it would be because he had looked at her across a quiet morning and asked if he could know hers. That was the thing about Amos Brenner. Every writer in town would come to know his name, because men like Bill Crane made sure their grudges were public. But Eva Sullivan's name had been passed around this town like a hand of bad cards for 3 years before Amos ever arrived. Every writer in town knew her name. Every drunk at every bar. Every rancher who had ridden through and stopped for a night. They knew it the way men knew landmarks. Useful, unremarkable, taken for granted. Only one man had ever asked to know it, and that man was currently bleeding on the floor of the Dusty Bell Saloon with her lie standing between him and whatever Bill Crane was planning to do next. 3 years earlier, Eva Sullivan had come to Caldwell Creek with $30, a carpet bag, and a letter of employment from a woman named Mrs. Clara Dobbins, who was supposed to be running a boarding house and needed a housekeeper. Mrs. Clara Dobbins, as it turned out, had died of fever 6 weeks before Eva arrived, and the boarding house had passed to her nephew, who was Bill Crane, who had looked at Eva Sullivan standing on his porch with her carpetbag and her letter, and had decided immediately that she was an asset rather than an employee. He did not say it that way. Men like Bill Crane rarely said what they meant directly. He said she could stay, that she could work in the saloon he had opened in the building next door, that she would earn her room and her meals, that everything would be fine as long as she understood how things worked in Caldwell Creek. She had understood within the first week. The saloon work was serving drinks, and the understanding was that she would smile at the men who came in, and she would not cause trouble, and she would not leave without settling what he called her debt, which was a number that changed every time she asked about it and grew faster than she could work it down. Eva Sullivan was not a woman who panicked. She was a woman who had grown up on a failing cattle ranch in the Texas Hill Country with a father who loved her and a mother who had died young, and a clear understanding that the world would not arrange itself kindly around her simply because she needed it to. She was 22 years old when she arrived in Caldwell Creek. She had dark hair that she wore pinned back during the day and let loose only when she was alone in her room, and she had gray eyes that people often described as silver when they were being poetic and cold when they were not. She was not cold. She was careful. There was a difference, and she had stopped expecting most people to recognize it. She had spent 3 years being careful in Caldwell Creek, careful enough to stay alive, careful enough to keep Bill Crane at arm's length on most nights without making him angry enough to act on his worst impulses, careful enough to save small amounts of money in a tin she kept hidden inside the lining of her carpet bag. Not enough to leave, never quite enough to leave. The number Bill called her debt moved every time she got close. That was her life when Amos Brenner rode into town on a gray morning in October of 1882 on a horse the color of creek mud, with a saddlebag that was mostly empty and a face that looked like it had made peace with hard weather. She had not noticed him at first. Men rode into Caldwell Creek regularly. They came off the cattle trails. They came from the direction of Tucson. They came looking for water and whiskey and a bed that did not require sleeping on the ground. She had learned not to look up every time the saloon doors opened, because looking up meant engaging, and engaging meant Bill Crane would come over and start making introductions that she had no interest in. But Amos Brenner had not come to the saloon first. He had gone to the livery stable, seen to his horse, asked the livery man what the town had in the way of a doctor, been told there was no doctor, but there was a woman named Me Hutchins who had once assisted a surgeon and knew how to close a wound, and then he had walked down the main street of Caldwell Creek looking at buildings the way a man looks at a town when he is considering whether it is worth stopping in or whether he should push on. He had stopped. Eva did not know any of this that first day. She learned it later, piece by piece, the way you learn anything from Amos Brenner, which was slowly and honestly, with no part of it decorated to make him seem better than he was. What she did know on that first day was that when Bill Crane shot a stranger in her saloon and she walked in and told the lie about the governor, the stranger on the floor had caught her eye and given her the smallest nod she had ever seen a man give. Not a nod of gratitude, not a nod of recognition, a nod that said, "I understand what you are doing and I will follow your lead." That was unusual enough that it stayed with her. "The governor does not send men to Caldwell Creek," Bill Crane said, but some of the certainty had gone out of his voice. "He does when there are reports of unlawful seizure of water rights," Eva said, which was a thing she had heard the men at the bar arguing about for 2 months, and which she had no idea was relevant to the stranger, but which sounded official and complicated. And complicated things made Bill Crane nervous because he had a great many arrangements in this town that could not survive close scrutiny. Bill looked down at Amos. Amos said nothing. He kept his expression perfectly still, which was either very good self-control or the consequence of a bullet wound making most other concerns seem distant. "Get him up," Bill said finally, to no one in particular. "Get him to Me Hutchins. He is who she says he is. I do not need him dying on my floor." 2 of the men who worked for Bill hauled Amos to his feet. Amos stood, slightly gray in the face, holding his right arm against his body, and his eyes moved to Eva one more time before they walked him out. She did not follow. She stayed and cleaned up the blood from the floor and did not allow herself to think about what had just happened until she was back in her room that night with the door latched and the tin of money in her hands. She had made herself a target. That was the thought that arrived first, cold and clear. Bill would want to know how she knew about the stranger. He would want to know if she had been talking to him before. He would want to know, above all, whether there was any truth to what she had said about the governor, because if there was not, there would be consequences for the lie. But underneath that thought, quieter and more unsettling, was another one. The stranger had trusted her. Without a word between them, without a single reason to, he had looked at her and decided she was worth following into her story. Nobody in Caldwell Creek had trusted Eva Sullivan in 3 years. It was a strange and frightening feeling, like a muscle that had been so long unused that the first movement of it caused more pain than relief. She went to see him the next morning. Me Hutchins lived at the north end of town in a house that smelled permanently of dried herbs and lye soap. She was a small, brisk woman in her 50s with quick hands and no patience for foolishness. And when Eva knocked on her door just after sunrise, Me opened it, looked at her and said, "He's stable. He asked about you twice last night." "He does not know me," Eva said. "He knows something," Me said, and stepped back to let her in. He was in the small back room that Me kept for patients, propped against the wall on a narrow cot, his right shoulder wrapped in clean linen, the wound cleaned and closed. He was awake. His eyes were open and they found her immediately, which meant he had been listening for the door. He looked in the gray morning light like a man who had been places and done things, and had arrived at his current age, which she guessed at somewhere around 30, with a reasonable accounting of both. He had a straight, serious face and dark brown hair that had been sun-lightened at the ends, and he was wearing someone else's shirt because his own had apparently been cut off by Me, and the borrowed shirt was slightly too short in the sleeves. "You saved my life," he said. His voice was even and quiet, not the kind that announced itself. "I told a lie," Eva said. "It is not the same thing. I experience the right lie at the right moment is more valuable than most things people call heroic." She pulled the chair from beside the small table and sat down across from him. "What did you do to make Bill Crane shoot you?" I asked him a question he did not want to answer. "About the water rights." He was quiet for a moment. "Among other things." He studied her with a directness that she found neither rude nor alarming, which was remarkable given her experience with directness in this town. "You knew about the water rights issue. Every person in this town who pays attention knows about it," she said. "The Caldwell Creek water is being pulled from a spring that feeds 3 ranches to the east. Crane has been blocking the access road. The ranchers have been complaining for a year. Nothing has been done about it because Crane has an arrangement with the county sheriff." "His name is Dobbins," Amos said. "The sheriff's name is Ray Dobbins. He is Bill Crane's cousin by marriage. And Crane also owns the building that houses this saloon, and the boarding house next door, and the grain store. And he holds the deed on 4 properties whose owners borrowed money from him." Amos was quiet for a moment in a way that suggested he was fitting pieces together. "You know a great deal about the arrangements of this town." "I have been here for 3 years," she said. "I have served drinks to every man who made any of those arrangements. People talk when they drink. They stop noticing who is listening. And what is your arrangement with Crane?" It was a direct question, asked without any of the smirking undercurrent that men in this town usually brought to any question about her. She looked at him and tried to determine whether he deserved an honest answer. He met her look without flinching or looking away, and she noticed that his eyes were a shade of brown that was almost amber near the centers. "I owe him a debt," she said. "He sets the terms of a debt that keeps growing." "Yes." He said nothing to that. He did not offer sympathy or judgment or advice. He simply received the information and let it sit, and that restraint was so unusual that she found herself wanting to keep talking, which she recognized as something to be careful about. "Who are you?" she asked instead. "And why did you come to Caldwell Creek?" "My name is Amos Brenner," he said. "And before I answer your second question, may I know yours?" "Your name I do not want to assume." She paused. In 3 years nobody had asked. They had told each other, passed it around, announced it. The bartender at the Dusty Bell had introduced her to Bill's associates as Eva, just Eva, no last name needed. Bill himself had never used anything but her first name and had a particular way of saying it that made it sound like a warning. The men at the tables called it out when they wanted a refill. It had never been a question. It had always been an announcement. "Eva Sullivan," she said. "Thank you," Amos said. And then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, he answered her question. I am a land surveyor contracted by a group of ranchers to document the water diversion occurring on Crane's property. I have the instruments and the paperwork in my saddlebag. Or I did until Crane apparently had my bag searched while his men carried me here. She absorbed this. He has your documentation. He has my bags. Whether he found everything is another question. He paused. There is a second copy of the initial survey report. I sent it ahead to Tucson before I arrived. That is why he shot you. He thought I had come to threaten him. He was not entirely wrong, except that the threat is legal rather than physical. She looked at his shoulder. He still shot you. Yes. He is a man who responds to threat with immediate action, which tells me he is afraid of what the survey shows, afraid men do dangerous things. She stood up from the chair, because sitting still was starting to feel like a decision rather than a posture, and decisions required more thought than she had given this yet. You cannot stay at Me's forever, she said, and you cannot go back to the saloon. No, and if you go to the sheriff, he will side with Crane. Also correct. She walked to the small window and looked out at the street. The morning was pale and cool, which would last about 40 minutes before the Arizona sun burned it away. A horse was tied at the post outside the grain store. 2 men were talking on the far corner. Regular morning. Nothing that would tell a stranger that the town was arranged around the interests of one man who did not welcome scrutiny. There is a man named Henry Greer, she said, still looking at the window. He owns the middle of the 3 ranches that have been cut off from the spring. He comes into town on Thursdays for supplies. Today is Wednesday. If you send word to him tonight, he might come early. You would do that, she turned from the window. I told a lie for you yesterday without knowing anything about you, she said. I would like to know whether it was worth it before I decide how much further I am willing to go. Something shifted in his expression. Not softened exactly, but opened, the way a door opens when someone turns the handle carefully from inside rather than forcing it from without. That is a fair position, he said. Get some rest, she said. I will see about getting a message to Greer. She left Me's house and walked back down the main street in the strengthening morning light, and she was aware of herself in a way that she had not been in a long time. Not the awareness of being watched, which was constant in Caldwell Creek and which she had learned to carry like extra weight, mostly without thinking about it. This was something else. A kind of internal attention, as if some part of her that had gone very quiet over 3 years had raised its head at the sound of something familiar. She put Henry Greer's name in a note and had the livery boy ride it out to the Greer ranch before noon. Then she went to work her afternoon shift at the saloon and served drinks and smiled at the right moments and watched Bill Crane's mood the way you watch weather when you have no shelter, constantly and with attention to detail. He was suspicious. She could see it in the way he kept looking at her across the room. Twice he started toward her and then redirected, which was his pattern when he was thinking something through before acting on it. She kept her movements easy and her expression neutral and told herself she had done nothing yet that could be proven as interference. Amos Brenner spent 3 days at Me Hutchins's house, and Eva went to see him each morning before her shift. The visits were efficient at first. She brought him information about what Crane knew, what he was planning, what the town's mood was. He gave her context about the water rights case, about the ranchers who had hired him, about the legal processes that were technically available if someone could get the documentation to Tucson in an official capacity. But efficiency, she found, had a way of developing edges when 2 honest people spent enough time close to it. By the second day, the business portions of their conversations were getting shorter, and the other portions were getting longer, and she was not entirely sure how that had happened. He asked her things, real questions, careful questions, the kind that treated her answers as important. He asked how she had ended up in Caldwell Creek, and she told him about the letter from Mrs. Dobbins, about the $30, about the carpetbag, and he listened the whole time without interrupting. He asked how she had learned so much about the town's business arrangements, and she explained about listening, about how invisibility is its own kind of information gathering, and he said that he understood that more than most people would expect. "I have spent most of my working life in towns where I was not from," he said. "You learn quickly that the people who are overlooked are the ones who see the most." "Where are you from?" she asked. "Kansas, originally. A farm outside Lawrence. My father surveyed land before me, and before that his father had been a trapper who understood territory better than most men understood their own parlors." He paused. "I have not been back to Lawrence in 7 years." "Why not?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because the farm is gone. Drought took it when I was 23. My father died the following spring. My mother moved to live with her sister in Ohio." He said this carefully, as a man does when he has had time to make peace with something but has not pretended to himself that the peace is complete. "There was nothing to go back to, so I went forward." "And you wound up in Arizona." "Land surveying takes you where the disputes are," he said, with a slight wryness that she realized was humor, quiet enough that you could miss it if you were not paying attention. "And disputes follow water and cattle, which in this part of the country means Arizona, Colorado, and New Mexico territory mostly." "Do you like it?" she asked. "The work?" He considered this seriously, as if it were a real question rather than a conversational gesture. "I like precision," he said. "The land is what it is. You measure it correctly or you measure it wrong. There is no version of a survey where the creek moves because you wanted it to. I find that restful." She thought about that for the rest of the day. The idea of something being restful because it was true regardless of who wanted it to be otherwise. It had been so long since anything in her life had been simply, uncomplicated true. Henry Greer arrived on Wednesday evening instead of Thursday morning, which meant the livery boy had ridden fast. He was a broad, weathered man in his late 40s, with the specific exhaustion of someone who has been fighting a bureaucratic battle for long enough that the exhaustion has settled into his posture permanently. He came to me Hutchins's house rather than the saloon, which told Eva that he trusted me and had enough sense not to walk into Crane's territory with news. She introduced them. Greer and Amos talked for 2 hours. Eva sat in the corner and mostly listened. She learned that the water diversion had been going on for 14 months, that 2 of the 3 ranches had lost significant cattle to dehydration the previous summer, a summer that had been brutal even by Arizona standards. That one of the ranchers, a man named Perkins, had tried to confront Crane 6 months ago and had ended up with a broken jaw and a burned outbuilding, and the sheriff had found no cause for charges. She also learned, by watching Amos work, how he thought. He asked precise questions. He separated what could be documented from what could only be testified to. He spoke without rancor about serious injustices, which she recognized as a professional habit that was serving him well, and she also recognized that the absence of rancor did not mean the absence of feeling. When Greer described the cattle losses, something moved briefly through Amos's expression before the precision came back. After Greer left, Amos looked at her in the lamplight of Me's back room and said, "I need to get to Crane's property and complete the survey. There is a specific point where the diversion was built that needs to be documented with my instruments." "You have been shot," she said, 4 days ago. My left arm works perfectly well and the right is improving. If Crane catches you on his land, he will not stop with a shoulder wound." "No," he agreed. "He will not." He looked at her steadily. "I am not asking you to come with me." She had known this was where they were heading since the second morning. She had known it in the way you know a storm is coming, not because you can see it yet, but because something in the air has changed and your skin is aware of it before your mind catches up. "When?" she asked. "Sunday morning," he said. "Crane will be at the Sunday morning card game he hosts at the saloon. He is there from 8 until noon. I have verified this with me. He has men who watch the property." "Yes, there are 2. One patrols the southern fence line from sunup until mid-morning and takes a break at the bunkhouse around 9. The other watches the north pasture but stays near the barn." He had been listening carefully too, she realized, gathering information from every available source. If I go in from the eastern side, along the dry creek bed, there is a window of approximately 40 minutes where the patrol gap is largest. You have thought this through. I have thought about little else for 4 days, he said. I have also thought about what happens to you if I succeed and Crane's arrangements here fall apart. She had thought about it too. If his water diversion is documented and brought before a land commissioner, and if the ranchers pursue the legal case, Crane's position in this town weakens. If it weakens enough, his ability to enforce my so-called debt weakens with it. Or he becomes dangerous. He is already dangerous, she said. The question is whether the danger is manageable. Right now, it is not. She looked at her hands in her lap. I have been careful for 3 years because careful was the only option I could see. This is a different option. She looked up at him. He was watching her with that quality of attention she was still getting used to, the kind that made her feel like a full person rather than a convenience. She felt something shift inside her that she immediately recognized and immediately tried to be sensible about, because this was not a moment for that, and she was 25 years old and supposed to be past the age of letting feelings run ahead of circumstances. But she also knew, with the same certainty that Amos's survey instruments brought to the measurement of land, that something had already begun. Sunday morning, she said, I will watch from the eastern approach. I know the dry creek bed. I used to take the long route to Mies before I stopped needing an excuse. He looked at her for a moment. Eva, he said, and the way he said her name was not the way anyone in Caldwell Creek said it. It was not a summons or a label. It was her name, hers specifically, used because it was what she was called. Thank you. Do not thank me yet, she said. Wait until it works. The next 2 days were some of the most carefully constructed days of her 3-year stay in Caldwell Creek. She maintained her usual patterns with surgical precision. She worked her shifts at the saloon. She smiled when she needed to. She served Bill Crane his whiskey at the usual time and did not flinch when he looked at her with his assessing, proprietary stare. She gave him nothing. She was a window that let the light pass through without retaining any impression of it. But inside, she was making calculations that had nothing to do with quiet survival and everything to do with something larger and more frightening. And she was beginning to admit, more alive than anything she had felt in 3 years. On Saturday night, Bill Crane came to find her after the saloon closed, and the last drunk had been walked out. She was wiping down the bar when he appeared, and his mood was the bad kind, the contained kind that was worse than shouting because it could go anywhere. The surveyor, he said. She kept wiping the bar. What about him? He is still at Mies. She has not cleared him to travel. His shoulder is healing slower than hoped. The lie came out smooth. She had been practicing it. He is not a government man, Crane said. I had a wire sent to the county office. No record of any official survey commission. He is contracted by private citizens, she said, which was true, and which she could say because it was true and therefore more convincing than any invention. Private citizens can commission surveys. It does not require government authorization. Crane was quiet. He had a way of being quiet that meant he was deciding whether to push harder, and she kept her hands moving on the bar and her eyes on the wood. I want him gone by Monday, Crane said. You can tell him that yourself, she said. I am telling you. She looked up. This was the moment that required the most precision, the most control, because this was the moment where she had to look at Bill Crane and show him nothing he could use. I am not his keeper, Bill. I barely know the man. I introduced him to Greer because Greer came in asking about the new man in town, and I told him what I knew, which was almost nothing. That is the whole of it. He looked at her. She looked back, steady, empty, safe. He left without saying anything else, which was the best outcome she had been hoping for. She did not sleep that night. She lay on her narrow bed in the boarding house room that was technically hers on an account that technically showed what she owed, and she looked at the ceiling and let herself, for a few hours, imagine what it would look like if Sunday worked, if Amos got his documentation, if the case went to a land commissioner in Tucson. If Crane's arrangements fell apart carefully enough that she could walk out of this town with her tin of money and no one chasing her. And then, quieter and more dangerous, if Amos Brenner was still around for any part of what came after. She did not let herself think about it too long, but she let herself think about it, which was its own kind of change. Sunday morning arrived clear and dry and bright. The kind of Arizona morning that was beautiful in the specific way of things that could kill you if you were not careful. Eva left the boarding house before the sun was fully up, taking the long route as she had described, following the edge of town north before cutting east toward the dry creek bed that ran along the boundary of Crane's property. Amos was already there when she arrived. He had his survey instruments in a canvas bag over his good shoulder, and he was wearing a worn brown coat that made him difficult to see against the brush. He looked at her when she came around the bend of the creek, and something in his face eased. "You came," he said. "I said I would." "A lot of people say a lot of things," he said without bitterness, just as fact. "I know," she said. "I have met most of them." She looked toward Crane's property. "The Southern Patrol is still moving. Give it 10 more minutes." They waited side by side in the shade of a dry cottonwood, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, not the kind that needed filling. She was aware of how close he was standing in a way that was purely physical and felt entirely natural, which was unusual enough to notice. "What will you do?" he asked quietly. "After this, if it goes the way it should." She thought about it honestly. "Go somewhere," she said. "I have money saved. Not much, but some. There is a town north of Tucson where I have heard there is work at a post office, official government work. Something with a salary and no one setting the terms of my presence." "Post office," he repeated as if he were placing it. "I am good with paperwork," she said, "and I can deal with difficult people calmly. I have had considerable practice." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "You have. What about you?" she asked. "I will go to Tucson with the documentation," he said. "File with the land commission, testify if needed. It will take weeks, possibly months. And after that, a pause." He was looking at the line of brush marking the edge of Crane's property. "I had not thought much past Tucson," he said. "That is a habit I have gotten into, not thinking too far past the current problem." She understood that. She had lived that way for 3 years. It was protective. It was also, she was beginning to see, a way of letting the future become only hypothetical. "The patrol has gone in," she said. He went. She stayed at the tree line and watched him move through the dry creek bed with a sureness that came partly from planning and partly from the kind of physical awareness that people develop when they have spent years working alone in open country. He moved quietly, economically, without the self-consciousness of someone performing carefulness. She watched the barn. She watched the bunkhouse. She watched the fence line to the south. 40 minutes. She counted them in her head by the quality of light shifting on the dry grass. He was back in 37. He came around the cottonwood with the canvas bag and a line of dried grass on his coat, and his face was concentrated and still, and he said, "I got everything I needed." She let out a breath she had not been aware of holding. All of it. The diversion point, the measurements, the documentation of the obstruction to the natural flow. All of it. He patted the canvas bag. "This and the copy in Tucson together are more than sufficient." She looked at him in the morning light, this man she had known for less than 2 weeks who had arrived bleeding on a saloon floor and had said thank you for her name, and had waited 10 minutes in a dry creek bed rather than going before it was safe, and she felt something so clear and certain that she stopped trying to be sensible about it. "I am glad you did not die on that floor," she said. He looked at her. "So am I," he said, and the way he said it was different from how it might have been said. Not a joke, not a deflection. He was looking at her the way he looked at his survey instruments when he was being most careful about accuracy, and the accuracy in his expression right now was something that made her heart do something it had not done in a very long time. They walked back to town separately, as planned at intervals, and they did not talk again until the afternoon, when she came to Me's on the excuse of returning a book Me had lent her, and found Amos packing what he had left of his belongings. "Today," she said. "Before Crane checks on me again," he said. "I want to be past the county line before he knows I have moved." He looked at her. "Eva, come with me." She went very still. "To Tucson," he said. "I know that is not the town north of Tucson with the post office, but Tucson is a larger city. There are postal offices there as well, and I am going to be there for some weeks at minimum, and I would rather—" He stopped, looked away briefly, looked back. "I would rather not say goodbye to you here in this town with this much unfinished between us." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about the tin of money in her carpet bag. She thought about 3 years of being careful. She thought about the fact that this man had asked her name before he had done anything else, and that he had said thank you after she told it to him, as if a name were a gift that deserved acknowledgement. "I need 20 minutes," she said. "Take 30, he said. "I want to say goodbye to me properly." She went back to the boarding house. She moved quickly and quietly, which was a skill she had developed over years of not wanting Bill Crane to know where she was going. She packed what was hers: the carpet bag, the tin, 3 dresses, 2 books, her mother's small silver brooch, which was the only thing she had from before. She wrote a note and left it on the narrow bed addressed to nobody in particular, which described in 7 words that she was leaving and was choosing to do so. She did not say goodbye to Bill Crane. She did not feel that she owed him one. She met Amos at the livery stable, where his horse stood ready, and where Mee had apparently loaned them a cart horse on an agreement that Amos would send money back from Tucson for its care, which he had written into a small promissory note that Mee held with great satisfaction. Amos looked at her carpet-bag and her face and said nothing except, "Ready?" "Yes," she said. They left Caldwell Creek at 3 in the afternoon on a Sunday in October, with the sun beginning its descent and the light turning the color of something warm. They rode side by side on the Tucson road, and they kept talking as the afternoon wore on and the landscape changed, and the town of Caldwell Creek became first small and then invisible behind them. She told him about her father's ranch in Texas. He told her about learning to survey from his father, about walking the edges of fields in Kansas before he was old enough to understand what he was measuring. She told him about the letter from Mrs. Dobbins and what she had expected and what she had found instead. He told her about a survey job in New Mexico that had gone wrong in a different way, where the dispute had involved 2 families who had been fighting for a generation and who had used him as an excuse to restart a war, and how he had gotten out of that town with his instruments and nothing else. "You have a habit of leaving places quickly," she said. "I have a habit of landing in places where quick departure becomes necessary," he agreed. "Though I prefer to think of myself as adaptable rather than perpetually fleeing." She laughed, and she noticed the way he looked at her when she laughed, as if it were something worth looking at, and she decided that she would let herself notice that and not immediately pack it away into the part of herself where she kept things that seemed too good to be trusted. They stopped for the night at a way station 10 miles outside of Caldwell Creek, a low adobe building with a keeper who rented 2 small rooms for 25 cents each and served a supper of beans and cornbread that tasted better than the circumstances warranted. Eva took one room. Amos took the other. He said good night to her in the corridor and stood for a moment as if there was something else he wanted to say, and then he said good night again and went into his room, and she went into hers and lay on the rough blanket and looked at the ceiling and thought that everything she had felt for 3 years was a kind of sleeping, and that something was waking up, and that it was simultaneously terrifying and the most awake she had felt in longer than she could precisely remember. They rode into Tucson 3 days later, because the road was long and the cart horse was not fast, and those 3 days were some of the most consistently alive days she could recall. They talked for hours and then rode in companionable silence and then talked again. He pointed out things in the landscape that she would not have known to look at, the way certain rock formations indicated underground water, the angle of shadows that showed elevation changes, the distant smudge of smoke that meant a settlement rather than a wild fire. She told him about books she had read, about the particular quality of light on the Texas Hill Country in late October, about a conversation she had overheard at the saloon once between two men that had been so absurd and so genuine that she still thought about it when she needed to believe that people were fundamentally interesting. He listened to all of it, every word. He asked follow-up questions. He remembered things she had mentioned and referenced them later, which meant he had been paying attention in the way you only pay attention when something matters to you. On the second evening, at another way station, there was only one room available. They solved this by Amos sleeping on the floor and Eva on the bed, and he refused to hear any argument about the reversal of this arrangement, and she fell asleep listening to the sound of his breathing in the dark and felt, for the first time in 3 years, perfectly safe. On the third morning, riding toward the smoke and sprawl of Tucson, he said, "I want to say something and I want to say it correctly, so I may take a moment." "Take whatever you need," she said. He was quiet for 30 seconds, which she respected and did not fill. "I am aware that we have known each other for a very short time," he said. "I am also aware that the circumstances of our knowing each other have been somewhat unusual, and that unusual circumstances can create feelings of closeness that are real but may not survive normalcy." He paused. "I have thought about this carefully. I have tried to account for the fact that tension and risk can make things feel more significant than they are. And," she said, "and I have concluded that what I feel is not a product of circumstances," he said. "I concluded this primarily because the feeling does not decrease when I think about you in ordinary situations, when I imagine you working at a postal office in Tucson, when I imagine you reading in the evening, when I imagine Sunday mornings with no surveys to run and no horses to ride and nothing requiring any particular urgency. The feeling is consistent across all of those images, and it is," he paused again, "it is the clearest thing I have felt in a long time." She looked at the road ahead of them. The morning light was golden and the saguaro cactus threw long shadows across the red earth, and Tucson was still an hour away. "Amos," she said. "Yes. I have been careful for 3 years," she said. "Not because I was afraid of feeling things, because I had no one worth feeling things toward." She looked at him. "That is not currently the situation." He looked back at her, and something in his expression was so open and undefended that it made her chest ache. "No," he said, "it is not." They did not say anything else for a while, but the silence was different from before, weighted with something that was not a burden but a gravity, a specific pull toward each other that they were now both acknowledging without the need to be theatrical about it. Tucson in 1882 was a city of the desert, sprawling and energetic and full of people who had come from somewhere else and were in the process of deciding what to do next. It had hotels and offices and a proper land commission building with a flag out front and clerks who wore their good coats even in the heat. It had 2 newspapers and a telegraph office and several churches and more saloons than churches, which seemed about right. Amos filed his documentation with the land commission on the day they arrived, and the clerk who received it was a small, efficient man with spectacles who read the first page and looked up and said, "This is the Caldwell Creek water case." And when Amos confirmed it, the clerk said, "We have been waiting for this for 7 months," with the kind of quiet satisfaction that suggests someone has been waiting to be right about something. Eva found a room at a boarding house on the decent side of town, run by a woman named Mrs. Padilla, who was firm and fair, and charged a reasonable rate, and asked no uncomfortable questions. The room had a window that looked east toward the mountains and was clean, and was hers in a way that the room in Caldwell Creek had never been. She found work within the week, not the post office, which had a waiting list for positions, but a land records office 3 blocks from where Amos worked, where a man named Mr. Alvarez employed 3 clerks and needed a 4th who could write clearly and handle numbers and deal with difficult customers. She could do all 3. She started on a Thursday. Amos came to call on her at Mrs. Padilla's boarding house on the following Saturday evening, arriving at the front door with his hat in his hand, and asking to speak with her in the formal manner that Mrs. Padilla required, and which Eva found both slightly ridiculous and deeply touching, because formality in this context was a form of respect, and she was still getting used to being shown that. They walked along the Tucson streets in the cooling evening, and they talked, and when they stopped at the corner near the small plaza with the stone fountain, he took her hand in his and held it as if he had thought about doing it and had decided that now was the moment. His hand was warm and steady, and she held it back without hesitation. "I want to court you properly," he said. "I am aware that Tucson is not Kansas and that the terms are somewhat different, but I want to be clear about my intentions." "And what are your intentions?" she asked. "That depends," he said, "on whether my company is something you want consistently or only occasionally or somewhere in between." "Consistently," she said, without pausing to be coy about it, because she was 25 and had wasted enough time on caution. "Consistently would suit me very well." He squeezed her hand. "Then consistently it is." They walked home through the warm Tucson evening, with the stars beginning to show through the darkening sky, and it was one of the simplest and best moments of her adult life. Over the following weeks, the Caldwell Creek water case moved through the Land Commission with a speed that surprised everyone involved, apparently because the documentation Amos had gathered was so comprehensive, and the supplementary report from Tucson was so well constructed that there was very little room for dispute. Bill Crane hired a lawyer from Phoenix who argued procedural objections and delayed things by 3 weeks, but the facts of the diversion were not in question, and the Land Commission ultimately ruled that the diversion was unlawful and ordered it removed. Henry Greer rode down to Tucson personally to shake Amos's hand when the ruling came down. He was accompanied by the 2 other ranchers, Perkins and a man named Ochoa, and all 3 of them came to Mrs. Padilla's boarding house as well and shook Eva's hand with the directness of men who had decided she was owed something. "You are the one who kept him alive long enough to finish the job," Greer said. "He would have managed," she said. "Maybe," Greer said, "but you helped, and we don't forget that." Amos received his surveyor's fee from the ranchers, which was a respectable sum, and he deposited most of it with the Tucson Bank and spent some of it on new survey instruments to replace the ones Crane had damaged, and he put aside a portion that he mentioned to Eva with a directness that made her stop and look at him carefully. "I am saving toward something," he said. "Toward what?" she asked. "I would rather show you than describe it," he said. "Give me 2 weeks." She gave him 2 weeks, during which he was slightly mysterious in a way that she found both charming and mildly exasperating, and on a Thursday evening in late November, he took her on a longer walk than usual, past the eastern edge of the city center to a quieter street, where the houses were set back from the road with small gardens that were mostly dry in the winter but showed the bones of what they would become in spring. He stopped in front of a small house. Adobe, like most of the structures in this part of Tucson, a covered porch, 2 windows facing the street, a gate in the low fence that was slightly off its hinge. "It is available for rent," he said, "with an option to purchase. The owner is an older woman who has moved to live with her daughter in California and wants someone responsible in it." Eva looked at the house, then at Amos, then at the house again, the gate hanging on its one good hinge, the porch with its 2 wooden chairs that had been left behind. "You are describing a future," she said. "I am," he said. "I want to describe it to you honestly and let you tell me whether it is a future you would want to share." She was quiet for a moment. The evening was cool, and the sky had gone the particular shade of deep blue that it went in Arizona at this hour, before it crossed into actual dark, and the mountains to the east were silhouettes and the city sounds were muffled, and it was one of those moments that felt like something being handed to you with both hands and asked to be received. "Amos," she said. "Yes." "Ask me properly," she said. He turned to face her fully. His expression was the clearest and most open she had ever seen it, which was saying something because he was not a man who kept much hidden when he was with her. "Eva Sullivan," he said, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said. "Simple as that." The word landed like something that had already been true and was only now being said. He took her face in his hands with the same care he gave to everything that mattered to him and kissed her, there on the quiet street outside the house with the gate on one hinge. And she kissed him back with the accumulated feeling of everything she had kept carefully controlled for 3 years releasing itself at once, which was considerable. They were married in December of 1882 at the small Methodist church on Congress Street. Mrs. Padilla attended and cried in a dignified way. Henry Greer and his wife came down from Caldwell Creek for it and brought a wedding gift of a good cast-iron skillet that Eva used for the next 30 years. Mr. Alvarez came from the Land Records office. Me Hutchins sent a letter from Caldwell Creek that arrived the following week and expressed great satisfaction at the outcome. Eva Sullivan became Eva Brenner, which she appreciated for the specific reason that it was a name she had chosen, not one that had been applied to her from the outside. She kept her work at the Land Records office for the time being because she liked it, and because Mr. Alvarez was a fair employer, and because having her own income was something she intended to maintain regardless of the state of their combined finances. Amos continued his surveying work, which brought him into Tucson regularly between jobs and occasionally took him out to the surrounding territory for days at a time. She was not a woman who needed constant company, and he was not a man who took her independence as anything other than what it was, and they had worked this out before the wedding in a direct conversation that had left no room for future misunderstanding. He came back from every job. He wrote letters when he was away, real letters with real content, not just reassurances. She wrote back. He had her letters with him in his saddlebag, and she found this out because she asked to see the bag once when he came home and found them there, folded and worn at the creases from being read more than once. The house with the gate on one hinge became theirs in January, when they completed the purchase from the older woman's daughter, who came down from California to close the transaction and seemed genuinely pleased that the house was going to a young couple. Amos fixed the gate on the first Saturday they owned it, which was a small act of attention to detail that somehow told her everything she already knew about him. She planted things in the garden that spring. She had not gardened before, but she found that she had an instinct for it that was probably inherited from her father's ranch upbringing, and Mrs. Padilla gave her advice about what grew in the Tucson climate, and by summer there were things growing against the fence that made the front of the house look like someone lived there by choice. In the spring of 1883, she told Amos she was expecting a child. She told him at the breakfast table directly, because she had not spent her life being indirect. He went very still for a moment, and then he got up from the table and came around to her and held her for a long time, saying nothing, which she understood to mean everything. Their son, James Henry Brenner, was born in November of 1883. He arrived in the middle of an afternoon after a labor that lasted long enough for Amos to wear a significant path back and forth on the porch, and when Me Hutchins's recommendation, a local midwife named Mrs. Garcia, put the baby in Amos's arms, he looked down at the boy with an expression that Eva watched from the bed and knew she would remember for the rest of her life. It was the expression of a man who had just understood that the precision he brought to everything had been practiced for this, a life that required measurement and care and honesty, and the willingness to go in through the dry creek bed when that was the only way. James was a loud, emphatic baby with opinions about everything and dark hair like Eva's and his father's amber-brown eyes, and he made their house very small in the best possible way. Amos's reputation as a surveyor grew over the following years. He was known for the thoroughness of his documentation and for the particular quality of his testimony in legal proceedings, because he had the useful ability to explain complex things simply and without losing the precision that made them true. He worked cases throughout Arizona Territory and sometimes into New Mexico, and the work was good and steady, and brought in enough that Eva eventually reduced her hours at the land records office rather than leaving it altogether, because she found that having something outside the house was good for her, and Amos respected this without it requiring discussion. Bill Crane, for those interested in justice, did not escape consequences indefinitely. The water rights ruling cost him 2 of his Caldwell Creek properties, which had been leveraged against a debt related to the diversion infrastructure. A federal audit of his arrangement with Sheriff Dobbins, prompted by a formal complaint from the 3 ranchers, resulted in the sheriff's removal from office and a significant investigation into the financial arrangements between them. Crane himself was not imprisoned, which was a limitation of the available legal instruments rather than an endorsement of his conduct, but he was significantly diminished, and Caldwell Creek replaced its sheriff with a man named Torres who had the specific character of someone not interested in arrangements, and the town gradually improved. Eva learned this from Henry Greer's letters, which arrived 2 or 3 times a year, and served as a reliable chronicle of events in a place she did not miss, but had not entirely left behind. The 3-year experience of Caldwell Creek was something she had processed honestly and filed in the part of herself that she designated formative and done. Amos knew the full story, all of it, including the parts she had originally told with the minimum necessary detail. He had listened to all of it the way he listened to everything, completely and without the kind of response that would have made it harder to finish. "You survived something that would have broken most people," he had said. "It bent me some," she said honestly. "Bending and breaking are different," he said. She agreed with that. She was living proof of it. In 1885, their second child arrived. A daughter they named Clara, for the woman whose letter had first brought Eva to Arizona, because that letter, however misaddressed by circumstance, had eventually led to everything good. Clara had her father's measured temperament, and her mother's gray eyes, and a specific giggle that she deployed with surgical efficiency to get what she wanted from Amos, who was entirely aware of the strategy and implemented it despite being aware. James adored his little sister from the first week, and was extremely clear about this preference in a way that did not always make managing 2 small children easy, but was overall a testament to something going right. The house with the fixed gate was a good house. They had added to it by 1886, extending the back to accommodate 2 proper bedrooms for the children and a room that Amos used for his drafting work, where maps and survey documents were always in progress on the large table, and where Eva occasionally stood in the doorway in the evenings watching him work by lamplight, and felt something so settled and full that it was almost too large to fit inside an ordinary thought. He looked up from his work one such evening and found her in the doorway and said, "Have you been standing there long?" "A few minutes," she said. And nothing," she said. "I just like looking at you." He set down his pen. "Come in then," he said. "Do not look from doorways when you can come in properly." She came in and sat on the edge of his drafting table the way she had learned he did not actually mind despite the stated principle about keeping the table clear, and they talked about small things: the children, the garden, a survey job coming up in the spring, a letter from her mother's sister in Kentucky who had recently been in contact, the first contact from that branch of her family in many years, and the question of whether it was worth writing back. "Write back," he said. "People who reach toward you deserve the chance to show why," she wrote back. The correspondence with her mother's sister, a woman named Eva Sullivan Morley, proved to be one of those late-arriving good things that life occasionally produces. Agnes was warm and direct, and had 3 grown children of her own, and was genuinely interested in Eva's life in a way that felt entirely without agenda. They exchanged letters monthly, and eventually, in 1888, Agnes made the train journey west and spent 3 weeks with them in Tucson, sleeping in the guest room they had made by then, and spending her days in the garden with the children and her evenings talking with Eva and Amos about everything and nothing. And she went home and wrote a letter that said she understood now why Eva had found her way west and never found her way back. Amos was given a senior contract with the Arizona Territory Land Office in 1887, which meant regular work and a formal rate, and somewhat less of the uncertainty that had characterized the freelance years. He did not stop taking private cases when they were the right cases, but the combination gave their finances a stability that allowed them to begin the purchase of the house outright rather than renting. In 1889, they completed the purchase. Amos handed her the deed in the kitchen, where she was making the biscuits that had become, through a combination of practice and Mrs. Padilla's coaching, something she was genuinely good at. She wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron and looked at the deed and looked at him. "This is ours," she said. "Yes," he said. She set the deed on the table and went back to her biscuits, and he sat down at the kitchen table and watched her work, and neither of them said anything else about it for a while, because some things do not require discussion. They require only the presence of both people in the same room, aware of what they have built together, and willing to sit inside that awareness without making it into a speech. Their third child came in 1890, a boy they named Thomas, who was from the first day the most easygoing of the three, with a disposition so pleasant that Eva occasionally checked to make sure he was all right. He was. He was simply good-natured, which turned out to be a trait that ran in Amos's family and which James, who had never been particularly easygoing, observed in his younger brother with a kind of baffled respect. In the evenings, Amos read to the children. He had a specific reading voice, not performed, not dramatic, simply attentive to the words, and the children would arrange themselves around him in the sitting room in their various postures, James cross-legged on the rug, Clara with her legs over the arm of the chair, Thomas pressed against Amos's side as if proximity were its own form of comprehension, and Eva would sit across from them with her mending or her book or sometimes nothing in her hands at all, just watching the scene. And she would think about a narrow bed in Caldwell Creek, and a tin of money in a carpet bag, and a woman who had been so careful for so long that she had nearly forgotten that carefulness was not the same as living. She had been saved by a man who asked her name. That was the short version of the story. She had saved him first, technically, with a lie about the governor in a saloon, but he had saved her in the slower and more fundamental way, by looking at her and seeing a person with a name that deserved to be asked, and a future that deserved to be considered. She never forgot that. It was not the kind of thing you forget when someone offers you that particular form of attention for the first time in years. It changes the internal landscape. It marks a before and after in the way that very few moments actually do. Amos looked up from the book one evening and found her watching him across the room. The children were absorbed. Clara was almost asleep. James was frowning slightly at something in the text. Thomas's eyes were closed with his small weight against his father's side. Amos raised his eyebrows in the way that asked a question without asking one. She shook her head slightly, meaning, nothing, just this, just looking. He held her gaze for a moment with that amber-brown steadiness that had not dimmed in 8 years and went back to the book, and she went back to her watching, and the lamplight held them all in its warm circle, and outside the fixed gate the garden grew. And in the house with the deed in both their names, the children slept and breathed and grew by small increments that were invisible on any given day and enormous across years. And Amos Brenner kept reading in his quiet, attentive voice. And Eva Brenner kept watching from across the room with the full knowledge that she was exactly where she had chosen to be. They grew into their middle years together in the specific way of people who have survived something difficult individually, and then found each other afterward, which gives a particular quality to ordinary happiness, a depth that comes from knowing what ordinary happiness is not. They did not take each other for granted in the self-congratulatory way that some couples make a performance of. They simply paid attention, each to the other, consistently and specifically, in the way that Amos had paid attention to everything that mattered since before she knew him. He still surveyed land. The work changed as Arizona approached statehood, which was talked about and anticipated and delayed, and talked about again in the way of such things. And the legal framework around land documentation grew more complex and more important, which kept men like Amos busy in ways that were professionally satisfying. He trained 2 younger surveyors over the years, a young man from Sonora named Miguel who had a gift for mathematics, and a young woman from Flagstaff named Ruth who had a gift for managing difficult landowners. And he sent them both into the field with the same systematic thoroughness with which he did everything. Eva eventually became the chief clerk at the Land Records Office after Mr. Alvarez retired in 1891, and held the position for 12 years, during which she reorganized the filing system twice and established a cross-reference index that the office was still using 20 years later, and trained a succession of junior clerks who went on to competent careers throughout the territory. She also kept a garden that was, by the mid-1890s, one of the most productive small gardens in their neighborhood, and she had a reputation among the neighboring women for knowing exactly what would grow in this particular patch of desert soil, and being willing to share both the knowledge and the seedlings without making either into a favor that needed repaying. James, their eldest, grew into a serious and determined young man with his father's precision and his mother's willingness to walk into difficult situations with a clear head. He studied law at the university in Tucson when it opened its doors properly, and eventually became an advocate for land rights in the territory, which nobody was entirely surprised by. Clara became a teacher. She taught at the elementary school near the center of town, where she was known for her patience and her exacting standards, which were not contradictory in her hands, but had something to do with the specific combination of her parents' most essential qualities. Her giggle, the devastating strategic one, was still available when circumstances warranted. Thomas, the easygoing one, surprised everyone by developing into an accomplished horseman, and eventually running a livery operation that grew into a properly organized stable, with a real reputation for the quality of its animals and the fairness of its dealings, which seemed to suit him entirely. On an evening in 1895, after the children were grown and the house was quiet in the way that houses get quiet when they no longer contain small people making constant noise, Amos came in from the porch where he had been sitting with a glass of water watching the Tucson evening, and found Eva in the kitchen where she was finishing her tea at the table with a book open in front of her that she was not currently reading. He sat down across from her in the chair that was his by 13 years of habitual preference, and they looked at each other across the kitchen table in the lamplit quiet of the house they owned in the city they had built a life in, and the look between them was the kind that only exists between people who have moved through a great many days together and have allowed each day to matter. "I have been thinking," he said. "About what?" she asked. "About the gate," he said. She waited. "When I first showed you this house," he said, "the gate was hanging on one hinge. You fixed it the first Saturday we owned it," she said. "I did," he said. "And I was thinking this evening that it is a very good thing to fix what is broken when you have the means and the time to do it properly." He paused. "I was also thinking that showing you the house that night was one of the best decisions I have made in an adult life that has contained a fair number of decisions, not all of them good. The best one you made," she said, "was asking my name." He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "that is true." She closed her book. "I have been thinking too," she said. "About what?" "About the fact that we are both perfectly well and the children are grown, and you still have work you find meaningful, and so do I," she said. "And that I would like to do something I have not done while we are still in the condition to do it. Such as, I would like to see Kansas," she said. "Lawrence specifically, I would like to see where you are from." He was very quiet for a moment. He looked at the table and then at her, and she saw that she had said something that had hit a tender place, but not in the painful way, in the way of something unexpectedly offered. "The farm is gone," he said. "I know," she said. but the land is still there. The land always is. You said that once about surveying, that the land is what it is regardless of what anyone wants it to be. I would like to see what it is." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. His hands were still strong, slightly rougher than they had been from years of field work, familiar in every particular. "Next spring," he said, "we will take the train." "Next spring," she agreed. They took the train to Kansas in May of 1896. It was a long journey, and they spent it largely in each other's company, which was not a hardship. They passed through New Mexico and Colorado and into the plains, and the landscape changed slowly and enormously, from the red rock drama of the desert to the rolling immensity of the grasslands. And Eva watched it out the window for hours and understood something about where Amos Brenner's particular quality of stillness had come from, because this was a landscape that required stillness, or it would flatten you. Lawrence was a small but busy city with a university and several churches, and the specific energy of a place that has repeatedly survived difficult things and has decided to keep going anyway. They stayed 4 days. He showed her the streets where he had been a boy. He took her to the university grounds, which were pleasant and well-shaded. He took her to the edge of the city where the farms began, and they drove out in a rented buggy on a clear spring day to the section where his father's farm had been. The farmhouse was gone. Another house stood on the land now, occupied by a family who had come from Ohio 10 years ago and knew nothing of the Brenners. But the particular shape of the land was still there, the gentle rise to the north, the line of cottonwoods along the eastern edge, the way the creek ran through the lower pasture in a gentle curve. Amos stopped the buggy at the edge of the road and looked at it for a long time. She did not say anything. She took his hand and held it and let him look. After a while he said, "My father taught me to survey right here, in this field. He said if you can measure what is in front of you accurately, you can go anywhere and still know where you stand." "He was right," Eva said. "Yes," Amos said. "He was." They drove back to Lawrence in the late afternoon, with the cottonwood trees catching the light and the spring air coming sweet off the fields. And that evening, they ate dinner at the hotel and talked about the children and about Tucson, and about what they might plant in the garden when they returned. And at some point Amos laughed at something she said, a real laugh, full and unguarded, and she thought, this is what it was all for. This is what 3 years of careful and a lie in a saloon and a dry creek bed and a gate on one hinge were in service of. This man laughing in the lamplight of a Kansas hotel, this life, which was not the life she had expected but was so much better than anything she could have designed for herself, that the contrast was not painful but grateful. They went home to Tucson in late May, and the garden was waiting, and the house was exactly as they had left it. And there was a letter from James about a land case. He was working, and a letter from Clara about her school, and a brief note from Thomas about a horse he was particularly pleased with. And they sat on the porch in the evening and read the letters, and then sat a while longer in the comfortable silence of people who have been to a place together and come back together and are glad of both. In the autumn of that year, 1896, they had a grandchild. James and his wife, a young woman named Dora who had met him at the university and who Eva had immediately recognized as someone who knew exactly what she wanted and was not embarrassed to say so, had their first child, a boy they named Robert, which was James's father-in-law's name, and which also happened to be Amos's brother's name, which turned out to be a coincidence that pleased everyone. Amos held his grandson for the first time in a hospital room in Tucson, and his expression was everything Eva expected it to be, which was the particular expression of a man who has just been given direct evidence that the life he has built is going to continue past him in the form of people who carry forward the best parts of what he put into it. She stood next to him and watched them both, the old surveyor and the very new person, and the feeling was so whole and complete that it had no room in it for anything missing, because nothing was missing. That was the thing she had spent 3 years in Caldwell Creek not knowing, that a life could actually arrive at wholeness. That you could end up with a house that was yours and work that mattered and children who were becoming themselves, and a man beside you who had asked your name the first chance he had, and had kept using it correctly ever since, with the specific care of someone who understands that a name is not a label but an acknowledgement, that to know someone's name properly is to know that they exist as a person fully distinct from your own needs and expectations, with their own weight in the world. Every rider in Caldwell Creek had known her name. They had known it the way men know landmarks, useful, taken for granted, passed around without permission. Only Amos Brenner had asked for it. And in the asking, he had made it hers again. She looked at him holding the baby, and she thought, all of this started with a question. A man on the floor of a saloon with a bullet wound looking up at the woman who had just saved him with a lie about the governor, asking if he could know her name before he did anything else, before he explained himself or thanked her or asked for help, asking to know her name because she was a person and persons have names and names are not taken, they are given. She had given it. And everything, all of it, the house and the garden and the children and the Kansas trip and the fixed gate and the biscuits and the deed and the letters and the evenings on the porch and the surveys and the land records office and the grandchild now in his arms, all of it had grown from that single act of asking. It was still the best thing she had ever done, she thought, telling him her name. And she would tell him so, she decided, tonight on the porch after they went home, because Amos Brenner was a man who appreciated directness and who was always, even after all this time, a little surprised when she said things that were entirely true about how she felt about him, and she liked that surprise, liked being the person who could produce it in a man so generally composed. She would tell him tonight that she was glad he had asked, and he would say that he was glad she had answered. And then they would sit on the porch in the October evening with the mountains to the east and the city humming its usual song around them. And she would lean against him the way she had been leaning against him for 14 years, and he would put his arm around her the way he always did, with the ease of something that has been done so many times it has become the body's own knowledge, and the stars would come out over Tucson, and the night would be quiet and enormous and full, and Eva Sullivan Brenner would be home. She was home. She had been for a long time, and she would be for all the time that remained, which was, by every honest and careful measure, exactly enough.